Now let's take a look at some markup that you're probably quite familiar with, and then see how to do the same thing in HTML5 with some of the new elements and attributes available. So what I have here is some sample code taken off of my podcast website where I can show you the difference between HTML or XHTML and HTML5. So you'll notice at the top up here, I'm working with a doctype, and I'm making sure to be very conscientious about the type of doctype that I'm using. There's been a lot of controversy over the years about the types of doctypes that you use and how browsers behave in light of them. So here I'm setting up this page as being 1.0 transitional. Then also for XHTML, I need to make sure to include my XML namespace, so I'm doing that right here within the HTML tag. Further, as we take a look at the file, you'll see that I have a script tag, and I've made sure to include the content type within the script tag. And then I have a couple different structures here. I've got an opening div, and then another div which acts as the container main, like I've called it here, and basically all the structures that I need in order to make this web page. So this type of construction should look pretty familiar to you. Now let's take a look at the same page redone in HTML5. So this is how the page looks in the browser. I'm using not only new HTML5 elements, but also some CSS3 in order to style it the way I want it to look. So as I scroll down on the page, everything within this main area here is added into the main element within the page. And then I have a header. And then what you're seeing here in the middle area is inside the article element. I'm using the native audio controls in order to be able to allow people visiting the web page an opportunity to play the podcast right there on the page, and then also download it here with this link. I'm using the aside element over here so I can provide some information about the guest on the podcast. As I scroll down a little bit further, you'll see that I'm using the mark element, which is giving a highlight to the text found here on the page. Now, Chrome's default color for this is like a really bright highlighter yellow type of thing. So I went into the style sheet and sort of muted it down a little bit to the yellow that you're seeing there. Again, over here on the side, you'll notice that I have another aside element that I'm adding some information in about the sponsor to the podcast. And as I scroll down even further, you'll see that I'm using the details and summary elements. So when I click on details, you can see the summary that shows up underneath it. So this gives that expand and contrast type of behavior that normally you'd have to script, but this is achieved by only using the elements here within the browser. And then I have a footer tag, and then down here I have some copyright information. And as I show you the code, you'll see that the date here is being wrapped with the time element and also stamped with pub date. So now let's take a look at the underlying code to this page. Now the first thing that you'll notice up at the top is the doctype. Now the XHTML doctypes, you pretty much need to have them saved somewhere or copy them out of something or have a tool put them in for you. But the HTML5 doctype is something that you could memorize if you want to. This is basically the shortest doctype syntax allowable, which switches the browser into standards mode. So if a browser doesn't recognize the HTML5 doctype, it'll automatically switch into standards mode. Then within the HTML element, we're telling it that the language here is English. And then for best results, in order to make sure that the browser knows the type of character set encoding is happening within your markup, it's best to put in this meta tag of meta charset UTF-8. The previous version of this meta tag was much longer, but again, this takes it down to the lowest common denominator. Now, as we take a look at the style sheets, the first thing you'll notice here is a link element. This has the relative equals style sheet and the content type of text/CSS. Now, none of that has changed, but when we take a look at the style element, you'll notice here that I have some CSS injected directly into the page. But the style element does not have a content type attribute associated with it. Now, I don't know the last time you used anything except CSS in order to style pages, like maybe images, but CSS has been the language used to style HTML for a very long time. And so now it's accepted as the default value of content type for the style element. Of course, if you wanted to use something else, you could certainly do that by declaring the type attribute and providing a different value. But the default value in HTML5 for the type attribute is text/CSS. Now, just like I'm showing you here with the link element, if you need to access a separate file from the page that you're on, then you still need to provide that type information. But here within the style, since it's an inline style, I don't need it. Now let's scroll down the rest of the page and see what else is available. Now, instead of just plain vanilla divs in order to mark up the page, I've used some of the new elements, which again provide semantic meaning to the page. And when I'm talking about semantic meaning, this gives a machine the opportunity to have an idea of what sort of meaning is placed on the content inside these elements as it looks at the markup on the page. So here within this file, I'm beginning with the body element and then opening and closing up the main element. From there, I have some script that I want to make available on the page. And here, this follows the same rule as it does with the style sheets. Notice I'm referencing an external file. So here the content type is text/JavaScript. But I have an inline script to the page, so I can just open and close this script element and completely leave off the content type. And this is perfectly valid code. Because again, I don't know the last time people used anything except for JavaScript in order to provide behavior to a page. There was a day when I used VBScript, but that's been a very, very long time. So now within HTML5, the browser just assumes that you're using JavaScript. Now let's take a look up at the top of the main section here again. Now, like I've said, instead of just using plain vanilla divs, I've created a header for the page. Here within this header, I have the logo that shows up for the page, as well as a couple headings. Now, I've used CSS in order to make the logo appear on the page. This is an old trick that's used in order to make sure that the content on the page is exposed to search engines well. And so that's not necessarily HTML5-ish or not, but something that's interesting here is when you take a look at this anchor tag, you'll notice that it's a container for the H1 and the H2 elements. Now, in previous versions of HTML, this was not allowed. You could only have an anchor tag inside of a paragraph or inside of a span or inside of an element like that. But here I can create a clickable area by having that anchor tag act as a container for more information. Now, for the rest of the header, I have my nav element. Now, like I told you before in the slides, the nav element is used in order to contain navigation to the site. So you notice here for the home page, it's going to the root of polymorphicpodcast.com. For shows, it goes to the root/shows and on and on. So inside my nav element, I do have an unordered list and the list items and all of that type of structure you're normally used to seeing within an HTML page. But I put this within the nav element because this is the navigation for the page itself. Now for the content and the meat of the page, I've placed that within an article element. Now, much of what you see within this markup is unchanged, so I'll point out a few of the items that are a little bit different here within HTML5. First, if we take a look at this div for the players, I've added in controls in order to be able to allow people visiting the website an opportunity to listen to that podcast right there on the page. So I've used the audio element. Now I've added the controls argument in order to allow that element to have the controls appear on the page. Now this kind of highlights something that's different within HTML5 as opposed to earlier versions, or specifically XHTML. Within XHTML, you had some very stringent rules. Element arguments were required to have a value. So if this was XHTML, instead of just having controls, I would have to say controls equals true or controls equals controls, something like that. But this isn't XHTML. In fact, HTML5 is not an extension of XHTML. It's not the next version after XHTML. It's the evolution of HTML. And so it's not trying to keep all of the rules of XHTML. Unfortunately, what happened with XHTML was that it was great for machines and for developers. We had all these wonderful rules that, if followed, would make applications that we knew how they were going to work. We could test against them and all was well. But the problem was that all of those rules were basically made to be broken. Because when you add people into the mix, when you add software into the mix that doesn't follow those rules, then you get code that's generated that doesn't validate. On top of that, when you have code that isn't validating, then it's not showing up the correct way within the browsers. That's what was happening at the height of the problems that we were facing with XHTML. So HTML5 basically places the value to users above the value to developers. So for instance, there's a rule within XHTML that says if you don't add a closing tag to say a paragraph element or a list item element, that's invalid code. Well, in the real world, oftentimes tags are not closed appropriately. So HTML5 works to even this out and says that you don't have to follow many of these stringent rules. Well, back to the audio element here. You'll notice here that it has a source element, and what I'm doing is providing the link to an MP3 file. Now I've also added stubs for the source because, as I showed you within the slides, different browsers are able to support different types of audio. MP3 is pretty widely supported, but I just showed you this structure here so that you could see how to use the source attribute or source elements underneath the audio element. Now, if all of that doesn't work, if there's a browser that does not support the MP3 file format, then it will fall back to the code that I have underneath the source. So here, what I have set up is some markup that will render my Flash player. So if there's a browser that doesn't either understand the audio element or it doesn't understand the type that I've given it, it will use this Flash player in order to be able to allow the user the opportunity to listen to that file. Now let's scroll down on the page a little bit more. As we come underneath the block quote, you'll see that there's some text here set inside the mark element. Now, this is a little bit contrived here for the demonstration that I'm showing you. Like I said, you would use the mark element maybe in a search result set of text where you want to show the word that they were searching on being highlighted within all of the other text that's shown on the page. Or perhaps you want to use it to highlight some information for a particular reason. I kind of chose some arbitrary text here, but basically the idea is that all you need to do is surround the text that you want to have marked with the mark element. Now further down, you can see how I'm using the figure and figure caption elements. Here, the figure has an ID, and inside of that, of course, you could add an image. Maybe you could add a chart that you created with a canvas element. Or here, I'm just using the pre element in order to add some pre-formatted text. And then I have my fig caption element, which is inside the figure markup so that it's relating to that figure. As we scroll down a little bit further, you can see here I'm using the details and summary elements. So I'm opening up the details element and then immediately adding a value for the summary. So the summary is what will show by default. And then when you click on what's in the summary, then what's inside details will appear underneath it. Now, if you want the details to appear expanded initially, you can add the open attribute to details. And so now when we take a look at the file, you can see that it'll be open by default. So here's the detail area. And because I have that open attribute set to details, it shows up as open. Now, when I click on it, it collapses and the open attribute is removed from that element. But again, it's all done directly through that markup in the browser. There's no JavaScript or jQuery required in order to make that happen. All right, let's go back to the markup. So that concludes the new elements that are within the article element. Now let's take a look at a few of the aside elements. So if a search engine were to look at this page, it would look and find the information within the main element, and then look in article as to see the information that's the most important. The content that's in the aside elements is loosely related to what's going on within the content of the page. Now, something that you'll notice here within aside is that I have an H1 element. I also have an H1 element up at the top of the page. Now, again, within older versions of HTML, this is something that you don't want to do. But within HTML5, the contents of elements are dependent upon their logical containers. So unless you're talking about something like the main element, where there can be one and only one of those on a page, the header here is logically contained within the aside. So this is saying that this is the primary header, or the H1, for this aside element. So you no longer have these constraints pressed upon you of how you use markup within the structure of your page. So since this make sure to check out Dave's blog information is the main title within the aside, that can acceptably be an H1 element here within that aside tag. So I've got two of those, one for information about the guest and one for the sponsor. And then I also have the footer information. Again, I'm doing the same thing here within the footer. I'm using a nav element and providing links to navigation locations within the website. And then I have some information about when this page was published and copyright info. So let's take a look for a moment at the time element. The time element has an argument of datetime where you can provide the year, month, day, and 24-hour time down to the second, and even the time zone offset. Now this is stamped with the pub date attribute. So as I told you within the slides, there can only be one element on the page that has pub date. The reason for this is because the pub date argument signifies that this was the date that this document as a whole was published. So you can use time for any other time that you want to, but here this is saying that this document was published on this date. So that's a bit of a round trip through some of the new elements used in a real-world HTML5 document. Now let's talk a little bit about feature detection.